Okay, we're up.
Awesome. We're being recorded. And we are live.
Good morning and welcome to our second anti-racism workshop series. In this series, we will deal with courageous conversations centered around race. Our first workshop series was for whites only. The caption was deceiving, however, the conversation was not, where we began to explore important dialogues about race relations, common perceptions, misperceptions, and the ideas that surround categorizing one race over another. In this particular workshop, we'll also explore a conversation about race. And in this one, we'll deal with the otherness. And many of you may ask, well, what is otherness? Otherness is the conversations you have amongst races about races. Hard to believe that there are racist ideologies within different groups. Well, there are. So this workshop is designed to explore those. The recent rise in Asian hate crime, pitting one race against another, and having conversations that are meant to be exclusionary or exclude one race over another. As always, our wonderful and fabulous leader of Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, our 11th president, Dr. Parham, will deliver a message this morning, which encapsulates our position and our feelings about race relations. This is done in conjunction with the Merv Diamondley African American Political and Economic Institute, under the direction of our executive director, Dr. Anthony Samad. I believe we have a message from Dr. Parham.
I'm sorry, Judge Macklin. The message is not ready at this time. We can
proceed. Okay, all right, that's fine. Then I'll move on to, and we'll show the video from Dr. Parham later on in the presentation or before we begin. But let me not waste time. Let us talk a minute about Dr. Anthony Samad, who is the executive director, and please allow me to introduce him. He has been the executive director of the Merv Diamondley Institute at Cal State Dominguez Hills for a number of years now. He is a nonpartisan research thinker who is the author of at least 6 books and who has championed the causes of minorities within Los Angeles County. Merv Diamondley was not only an inspiration for him, but also gave him valuable insight in race relations within Los Angeles County, which has led him to develop this popular series. It is under the direction of, at the guidance of the advisory board, that consists of Ron Turner, vice chairman and radio executive of KJLH, Nicole Jones, who is over foundations and is a grant executive, Laura Richardson, former Congresswoman, Daryl Sweeney, former mayor of Carson, Carolyn Williams, who is the immediate past board chair and over the sustainability and nonprofit consultant, Dr. Justin Gomich, who is our Diamondley Fellow, Cherise Freeman Weaver, a nonprofit executive and CEO over the Brotherhood Crusade, Forseki Hogan Rolls, CEO of Rise LA, the Honorable Steve Bradford, California State Senator, the Honorable Curran Price, Los Angeles City Councilman, Kevin McDowell, Executive Vice President of AGE, the Honorable Jawan Hilton, Carson City Councilman, Regina Smith, PhD, Vice President and Student Affairs of Los Angeles City College, Lindsay Hughes, a McDonald's franchise owner, Dwayne Davis, Dr. Dwayne Davis, school administrator and educational consultant, who will also be serving as a co-moderator today, Ludlow Creary, civil rights attorney, Patrice Marshall McKenzie, board chair with the Los Angeles Unified School District and chief of staff to one of the board members, Joey Hill, public policy consultant, Byron Reed, a banking executive for West Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, and our very own Michael Spagnow, who is the Cal State University Dominguez Hills provost. And that comprises the board, which is advisory to the executive director and helps to set the direction and the tone and supports all of the community endeavors of the Institute. Are we ready for Dr. Parr? No? Okay. Without any further ado, I introduce Dr. Anthony Samad, Executive Director of the Merv Diamondley Institute. Dr. Samad.
Thank you, Judge Macklin. And we appreciate everyone who has come in to share this conversation with us today. While we wait for President Parham's message, let's talk a little bit about this series. This series essentially came about as a result of a campus-wide edict by our president last June after the death of George Floyd, for our campus to work toward becoming an anti-racism institution. And he requested that all units of the university develop some type of anti-racism programming so that we could be a forward leader in the discussion around race and race relations, and more specifically, racial reconciliation. We wanted to tie this conversation to the vestiges of racism in America by using some of the symbols that have been in the past hurtful to all they were directed at. We started out with a symbol that represented the 72 years of legalized segregation in America, which essentially relegated Black people and others to spaces that they weren't to be included in, and it was called for whites only. And while we certainly had a lot of conversation and feedback around the title of the first workshop and the white only sign that was used, for this particular workshop, we wanted to also use a symbol of America's racial past for coloreds only, which was the designation for African Americans to be secluded in a space that was relegated to them so that they would not participate in the larger mainstream. We also wanted to have a conversation about race in terms of how we interface with each other. American racism is not exclusive to white people, and nor are white people have an exclusive licensing to discrimination and bias. We have seen, particularly over the last 50 years, a tribalism taking place in our communities in which other people of color sought to direct this cultural behavior toward other people of color, whether it was Blacks against Latinos, Latinos against Blacks, Asians against Blacks, Blacks against Asians, East Indians against others. We saw after 9/11, the Arab community targeted in several ways, or those who were perceived to be non-American. They were othered. And so this othering has caused us to look at how we have adopted a sad and historical cultural practice, racism, and targeted each other in that regard. And we have responsibilities in each community to own up to our own biases and how we treat each other within our communities. And so we're hoping today that our speaker will help focus us all on the latest phenomenon, which is the rise in anti-Asian bias and anti-Asian discrimination, as well as some of the conversations that are taking place in other communities around the relationships between Blacks and Browns, Blacks and others, and even in the Black community, where we have a preponderance of Black on Black hatred exacted on our own communities. And so I believe our president's presentation is ready now, and we'll move forward with it. We hope that you enjoy this workshop. We ask you to ask all the questions that you want to. One of the things that happened in our first workshop is because we had two dynamic speakers, we ran out of time for questions. This time, we opted to only have one workshop speaker so that we can create more space to engage our audience. And we'd like to thank our anti-racism co-chair of our advisory board, Dr. Dwayne Davis, for agreeing to moderate this series. Without further ado, we could bring forth the 11th president of the California State University, Dominguez Hills, Dr. Thomas Parham. They said they will let us know when the video is ready. This is what is called live television. So what we will do is we will lay context, okay, for this particular speaker. Momentarily, RMC, Dr. Davis, will introduce our featured speaker. She is someone who I've had a relationship with for nearly 30 years as part of a citywide dialogue after the 1992 LA riots, in which the Korean community suffered an innumerable amount of damages due to the rioting that took place, and it affected the relationships around the city. And so, Dr. Davis, if you would just give us a little bit about who our featured speaker will be today.
All right, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Samad, for the great introduction for not only myself, but for the presentation today. And so I want to start with welcome those that weren't here with us previously, and welcome back to those who are returning. As you know, this is our second part of a three-part series on anti-racism. We've had some wonderful, wonderful conversations before on our first session series, and I'm expecting the same as such on this series as well. For the benefit of those who are showing up for the first time, I want to recap our first workshop series where we had some dynamic speakers, as Dr. Samad mentioned. As he also mentioned to you, it was called For White People Only. Somewhat encouraging, somewhat polarizing, absolutely one that created much conversation and had us have a dynamic conversation with our speakers. Well attended. I believe we had over 600 individuals who showed up to participate in that conversation. Quite a conversation, quite a courageous conversation, somewhat uncomfortable conversation for some of our individuals, but nonetheless still a necessary conversation that we had. Our speakers provided some insight and perspective for us on anti-racism and left us all with some solutions on how we can move forward and help one another. Today, the workshop is called For Colored People Only. And so with that being said, just as the title, we'll be speaking, as Dr. Samad mentioned, on colored individuals, if you will, and how we engage with one another, some of the perils and pitfalls that you may have experienced yourself or have heard of others experiencing. With that being said, we have just as dynamic of a speaker as we did last time, Dr. Hai-Pin M. Dr. Hai-Pin M, you may know who she is. I'm certain you have seen her on CNN. You may have also heard her on NPR as a speaker. She's been honored as a Woman of Action for the California Assembly. She's also been featured in the Los Angeles Magazine as one of the 10 most inspirational women in Los Angeles. And she's currently the president of our Faith and Community Empowerment organization, which is a nonprofit organization. And we are really, really excited to have Dr. M with us today. And so with that being said, I'd like to bring on Dr. M if she is ready and available. With that being said, Dr. M.
Okay, I'll pick up from here because she's supposed to come in at 11:50. She's currently on another call, and she's leaving that call to come to this call. One of the things that we want to do is engage the audience. And so feel free to put your questions in the Q&A queue. Dr. Davis will relay your questions to the audience, and we'll have that conversation. Is there anyone who did not have an opportunity to ask a question at our last workshop that wants to bring forth that question while we wait for our guest speaker to come in? Feel free to do so. If not, I have a question.
Dr. Samad, one question that came through during the chat or through the chat is, how do you define otherness and how do you recognize otherness and how is it explained today? And how do you put it in context today?
Well, we've all been in spaces that we felt that we weren't welcome in, whether it is social spaces, whether it's political spaces, whether it's religious spaces, whether it's just being out in the public at large. We've all gotten that feeling, whether we visited a restaurant, whether we attended a church, whether we had an opportunity to just walk down the street. I think that we didn't recognize at that time that we were being othered. In other words, we didn't fit in a particular space and felt anxiety around being there or concern and anxiety around the way we were being treated. Oftentimes, we talk about the importance of diversity. Diversity is about inclusion. And the diversity agenda, both in California and nationwide, has been a part of the culture of California for over 30 years. Yet there seemed to be a problem. People had a problem with diversity. And so in 1994, a proposition was put on the ballot it was called Proposition 209, to eliminate the consideration of race in government jobs and education and in other spaces. It was at that point, people of color in the state of California felt that they were being othered. Some people called it a backlash. Other people called it fairness. There was a lot of benefits that were derived by people of color as a result of Prop 209, which said that we would take the top 10% of all people and allow them entry into college. As a result, the Asian community got a disproportionate amount of involvement and admissions into UC campuses. At the same time, African Americans admission decreased. And we've seen similar downward patterns as it relates to the Latino community. And so last year, there was an attempt to reverse Prop 209, Prop 16, which was defeated. And a lot of people thought that this was part of the previous administration backlash in terms of emphasizing a mainstream position that all lives mattered versus Black lives or brown lives or Asian lives. And so this conversation speaks to that, where, if you have been othered, and many of us have, diversity represented who was in the room, anti-racism represents how you feel about those who are in the room. And oftentimes, the stigma of otherness generally rises when people are uncomfortable about being around people of other races or valuing the contributions that those persons in the room may make. And so that's the definition of otherness, Judge Macklin.
And when you talk about, and when you talk about people who use the phrase, which has become controversial, all lives matter, how does that play into the conversation about otherness? Is it just a dog whistle or code for some other racist or ideological dogma that pervades this conversation?
Well, one of the things that our society is not good at is talking about race. The reason we had the the first workshop that we had focusing on our white brothers and sisters is because they feel uncomfortable talking about race. And oftentimes sit silent when those who do have hostile racial tendencies, they sit silent when they see those play out. They don't think it's directed at them, so there's no reason for them to get involved. The whole purpose of this anti-racism challenge that we gave at our last workshop is for us to become more vocal when we see racial behaviors enacted against someone, whether it's ourselves or whether it's other people. We have to speak up about it. That's the only way that we are going to have true racial reconciliation. And so I believe that part of the otherness conversation is to push out in the open the 800-pound gorilla, that there are tensions between races that don't necessarily include white people, and that we have to have conversations as it relates to that. There has been significant conversations in the Los Angeles community about the Black-Brown relationship because of the tensions that came out of California prisons, in which tribalism essentially dominates the existence of those who are incarcerated, in which they have to get with their own for protection. And then when people re-enter society, some of those attitudes continue to prevail. We have to look at some of the anti-Arab or anti-East Indian animus that has come out of the post 9/11 era, in which we saw people, whether they be Persian, whether they be Farsi, whether they be East Indian, have oftentimes suffered discriminations as a result of the feelings around the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And so we see that President Biden has agreed to finally withdraw all of the troops out of Afghanistan, which has ended up being a 20-year war. And many times you see a lot of our veteran community, express some of the hostilities that have been waged against them when they were serving, and a lot of those attitudes spill over into the larger society. And so, we can't act like all people of color are getting along, and that this fight is just against historical white racism, because many of the cultures that live in America have adopted all of the practices of the dominant culture, whether it's capitalism, whether it's individualism, or whether it's racism. Those behaviors have spilled over into the larger society.
So when you talk about those behaviors, let's talk about the global behaviors. We have a number of people who immigrate to the United States. And often people don't understand that there are racist ideologies in the countries from which they come that they keep and maintain when they get to America, which feeds into the larger racist narrative of the American population or American culture. How do we deal with that aspect of it when you talk about colorism?
Well, that's one of the things that we need to give more attention to, is globally, many of the perceptions that immigrants have about America, they get from television, and they get from some of the characterization of people of color that play out in the global media. And many times those shows are dated. Old television, old programming are filled with historical stereotypes of Blacks, of Latinos, of Asians, of East Indians, of Native Americans. And we are witnessing in this period of racial reckoning that many of the symbols that we thought were harmless in the past have now come full circle. We see that the Washington Redskins have decided to rename themselves the Washington football team in deference to the historical mischaracterization of Native Americans. Okay, we see that the dominant global cultural influence is hip hop, and we see, some of the street vernaculars that spill over, that are dominated in hip hop culture and hip hop music spill over into the larger culture, where everybody wants to be the N-word, or everybody wants to be hip or cool, not knowing that those words oftentimes cause pain to African Americans and others who were referred to in a derogatory manner by those terms. And so a lot of times, new immigrants are just bringing forward many of the images that they have seen about Americans, and particularly people of color in America, and they are trying to assimilate or acculturate by thinking and referencing those terms, that those terms are endearing because they're used as endearing symbols within particular communities. And so we need to educate. We've oftentimes had panels and conversations with younger people who try to destigmatize many of these negative terms, and many of them have said that they refuse to give them up. And so then they give license to other folk who will essentially use those same terms, saying if Black people can use them, then it's okay for us to use them also. And so it's a constant back and forth as to how we feel that we have to oftentimes correct people who want to continue to use popular culture as their guide for racial interaction. And sometimes it's a battle.
Thank you, Dr. Samad. Dr. Davis?
Good. Dr. Samad, we have a question from the field. I'll direct it towards you. You may be the one most able to answer the question. And so with that being said, it says, I'm curious to know how people are feeling about the recent news of the Senate passing an anti-Asian hate crime bill. Although we understand the importance of this action, do African Americans find this news ironic or unsettling?
Well, what generally happens in politics is public pressure generally spurs reactionary public policy. And we oftentimes see legislators trying to respond to events of the moment. What we should recognize is that the Asian American Pacific Islander community has become a critical mass, has become a significant policy player in terms of being able to address AAPI issues. In the meantime, African Americans have been waiting, for 170 years for an anti-lynching bill. African Americans are still being disproportionately assaulted and killed by law enforcement, by state-sanctioned racism. And you have to understand too, that the way Congress is made up, there are still sectional preferences that go all the way back to the Civil War. The symbols that offend us are seen as cultural reminders or part of the history of particular states in this country. organizations that have historically been terror organizations try to represent themselves as something other than that at the current time. And so you see Congress people pandering to constituent and constituent bases that can either get them elected or get them unelected. And so we shouldn't really have a problem with the Asian American Pacific Islander community demanding civil rights and civil rights protections, because we've been doing the same thing for the better part of 2 centuries. Just because one segment of the community gets recognized for what is happening to them doesn't necessarily mean that we should, object to that. What is objectionable, though, however, is if we're going to advocate for rights of one, we should advocate for rights of all. And that doesn't always occur, particularly as it relates to African-American rights. A lot of the advocacy that we have seen for the past 3 generations, are dismissed, as whining or belly aching when they're very, very real. And we see the outcomes of that in terms of income disparities, employment disparities, homelessness disparities. We see intergenerational wealth being passed, and in the process, segments of the society are literally going backwards. And so it's important for us, to give support to other communities who are being affected by the same behaviors that African Americans have historically been affected by. Because if we don't speak up for one, then at some point in time, we're all going to be impacted by the same type of negative cultural behaviors. And that's where the supremacy conversation comes in. And so I believe that it is important for us to support the Asian American Pacific Islander community in their efforts, because they were dog whistled, by the previous administration who mislabeled the coronavirus and tried to essentially use it as a way of verbal warfare to galvanize those who were domestic nationalists. Didn't want to call them terrorists, but they definitely rallied around the term of whiteness. And basically what we saw is it being disproportionately taken out on the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Davis, who will now introduce our speaker. And if you'll turn her camera on, we'll be able to see her.
Dr. Samad, thank you for your insight and for making certain that we were able to fill those gaps of in time that we may have had, but actually all of what you mentioned to the individuals in our audience was information that was necessary, and directing the questions to you from them was able to provide them some of the solutions and information that they are seeking. And so moving along with our program, I do want to say thank you for all putting up with us and for being patient with us. Our speaker is available now, and we would like to reintroduce her. Again, as I mentioned to you, just as dynamic of a speaker as in our previous workshop series, individual, Dr. Hypen M. She, as I mentioned to you before, has been seen on CNN. You may have heard her on NPR speaking on community engagement as well as community empowerment. Once again, she was Woman of the Year, Woman of Action, I should say, by our California Assembly Speaker, as well as featured in Los Angeles Times Magazine for one of the 10 most inspirational women of Los Angeles. She currently is the president and founder of Faith and Community Engagement, which is a nonprofit organization. And with that being said, I would love to turn over the microphone Zoom audience to our speaker, Dr. N. Dr. N?
Uh, Good afternoon. Thank you so much for, again, this invitation. Dr. Anthony Samad, thank you so much, as well as Dr. Dwayne Davis. Although actually I'm not a doctor, maybe God just promoted me, so want to be able to correct that. But again, I receive. Thank you so much again for this opportunity during this time of great assaults, especially on the Asian community. I have experienced tremendous solidarity from leaders from various communities, but especially I'm thankful for the leaders of the African American community. And I was sharing in an earlier presentation that, you know, people who know me know that I'm not shy, you know, when I'm in public settings. However, I have to say that I am shy on social media because I know that a lot of times nuanced conversations could quickly go down a rabbit hole when you're not in person. However, I have to say that when I received calls and when I saw that many allies, especially again from the Black community, use their social media platform to fight back the certain narratives that were being told of our community, it gave me great gratitude. And for so long, we have been told that our voices don't matter. But by being a recipient of this time, that I am learning to push myself to use my voice, to reclaim my voice, to be a voice for others as well. When I got this invitation and I saw it said for colored people only, I was going, you know, what is this about? But I really think that as an Asian American, seeing some of the assaults that are coming our way and visiting many social media rooms where there are honest, I guess, discussions, I have seen in some ways where people do not talk about the elephant in the room. And so I think that definitely there is the white supremacy, the long history of systemic racism that has set the game board and put the rules of the game. But in our day-to-day interactions, I have to say that it's really communities of color hating on one another. And I think that in that way, it is hurtful in that we are all victims of the same system. And the sooner that we could see each other the way I believe as a believer God intended, and not really buy into some of the narratives that we tell of one another that put each other in the category of evil, that we will no longer be victims of assaults of one another's hate. As it is, the system itself is, you know, puts undue burden on our lives, but to be able to then also do that to one another as another dimension of pain. And so in the social media rooms, I have seen where for my liberal friends, they blame everything on white supremacy, but ignore again some of the optics of communities of color hitting on Asians. And then the other extreme that I have also seen to the right is where they say, you know what, the police have never been there for us. And, you know, this is getting out of control. We need to gun up. And traditionally, historically, Asians have had the lowest gun ownership rate. But in the recent year, the rate of increase of gun ownership in the Asians have been the highest of any group. And so again, there is that kind of reality. And so for me, as someone who works so closely with different communities, seeing this really again breaks my heart because either solutions, I think, do not deal with the truth, the elephants in the room. And so in that way, today, I want to just share my experience, especially next year is the 30th anniversary of the Los Angeles riots. And I remember for the Korean community, Out of the $1 billion in property damage, over 40% were incurred by Koreans. Over 2,300 businesses were destroyed. And it wasn't just livelihood, but really it led to divorces, mental health trauma, people leaving the country, family breakups. And in those 2,300 were not just the businesses closed, but beyond that, everyone else in the surrounding communities, because those businesses closed, they also had to close as well. So again, there's a lot of untold stories and pain. But it was interesting that for me as an organization that came after modeling after First AME, I want to share a little bit of my backdrop of my story. You know, I grew up with my parents being in ministry, and they preached and they led people to Jesus and all that worship, etc. But they really ended up becoming unpaid social workers because the need in the congregation was so great. Contrary to the model minority myth, in year 2000, for example, Koreans were one of 4 communities whose income was below the national median. Even as of 2015, Koreans had the lowest home ownership rate of any group in LA County. And I'm just giving you 2 examples. And so again, because there was so much need in the congregation, my parents ended up becoming unpaid social workers. And for what they did have, they did pretty good. But I saw their struggle. In my heart, I always carried this desire, could there be a better way? And I grew up and I met Reverend Mark Whitlock and Pastor Murray from First AME. And they were doing the very same things that my parents were doing. But because they were able to set up an affiliated nonprofit, they were able to partner with the broader community and tap into those resources. So they were able to bring, from their offering $3 million, they brought in an additional $12 million. So they were able to be much more impactful in the way that they were able to give help. But also as a Korean American coming out of the LA riots and seeing our community kicked down and crying alone, a question for me was, why weren't there others to cry with us? And in this model that I saw at First AME, because now the partners had a vested interest in the church's success, they were lauding the work of the church in rooms and places where usually God's not mentioned, communities of color are not invited, or churches are mentioned. But because of their stake, right, they started to laud the work of the church in rooms and places, where their influence and welcome grew. And again, as a Korean American coming out of the LA riots, I thought, wow, this is an amazing model. But in addition, because of their growing influence, they were now perceived as a valued stakeholder, invited to the decision-making room. And I would say, again, communities of color are usually not in those rooms. Definitely Asian Americans are consistently left out of those rooms. But in this, I saw a win-win-win model. And I thought, wow, could I bring this to my community? And many miracles later, in 2001, our organization formed, and with lots of miracles, as mentioned, and we've had over 800 partners. But I would say, again, my greatest mentors have come from leaders from the Black community, including Dr. Anthony Samad. And so with that, whenever the discussion of Korean store owners or Asian store owners and Black customers and would come up, these great leaders that I respect and appreciated, good people, would, instead of in a normal situation, if someone said, oh, you know what, my livelihood was destroyed, would respond with empathy. Instead, they would almost turn into Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, and it would be this vindictive look. And for me, I struggled, and I really sought God for understanding. If they were people I didn't care for, that I didn't appreciate, I would have, easily said, oh, they're bad people, they're evil people, and just, brush that off. But because I knew otherwise, I really sought understanding. And one of the things that I came to realize was that there are narratives that were being told of our community, the Asian community, Korean community, that put the store owners in the category of evil. And when you do violence on evil or evil on evil, actually, like, you're fighting on the side of justice. And And unfortunately, that's what I realized. As long as these stories, these myths, and again, there's definitely a reality that Black customers face from Asian store owners that should not be denied. But perhaps by looking at the greater picture, that perhaps there might be a greater room for understanding and maybe even solidarity. And so, a lot of times, I give this example. If I want someone to jump, but they refuse, I will not be happy with them. But if I learn that they're in a wheelchair, something will shift in my heart. But it still does not take away my need for them to jump. But if I now know that they're in a wheelchair, my conversation will change drastically. Yelling at them will not resolve anything. It's futile. Instead, now my conversation and my approach for having them jump will be drastically different. Either at minimum, I'll throw them over my shoulder and jump together. Maybe I'll build a ramp or something, but yelling at them would not do so. And so in the same way, I would say that for many of the Asian store owners, and I'd be able to share a little bit of the PowerPoint, that we're in the same economic wheelchairs as the surrounding neighborhood. And we have as much to gain if the community advances. They live there just as long, if not longer. And so the conversation, by changing it from a perpetrator to a fellow stakeholder and what do they need, perhaps may lead to better solutions for all of us in this space. And I would liken that as I go over my PowerPoint, but perhaps for each of us as communities of color, we should think about what are the myths or the narratives that we tell of one another, that we put others in that category of evil. And instead, to give each other communities, right, one another, the benefit of doubt to say, what, at the end of the day, these are all good people. They all have their God-given light. Why are they behaving the way that they are doing so? Why are we hating one another? What is it that is leading us to hate one another? And again, there's the white supremacy, again, who set the game board. But on the day-to-day interaction, what are some of those myths? And so for me, I'm going to go over some of that with the Asian community. But I think that if we can have those kind of discussions and break down some of those myths, that we might be able to come to a better place, a better solution of addressing hate and violence and discrimination in our country and lead to better solidarity. The other day, we had some Black clergy leaders as well as Asian clergy leaders come together. And I was able to share a little bit of some of the things that I'll be sharing. But in addition, we asked, when did you realize that the model minority myth that robs the Asian community of solidarity with other communities of color and also resources that help advance our community, when did you realize that this was a myth? And when did you experience a moment of solidarity from the Asian community? And one of the leaders, very prominent, renowned, who I had a chance to meet at the White House Easter prayer breakfast, she mentioned actually that her only experience with Asians was with Asian store owners, and it wasn't something positive. And she mentioned that really she was shocked when we met at the White House Easter prayer breakfast, and an Asian woman, had come up to say hello in a very friendly way. And that she realized the myth was a myth at that moment when I was able to share. And one of the other Black clergy actually mentioned, she said, we should stop hating and start connecting. And I think that is a very powerful piece, that when we do not connect with one another, right, and really be able to, again, see the reality of each of our community's experience of pain and contribution and light, that we cannot come to, again, the right solutions, because we're talking about, we're not dealing with the whole truth as well. So let me go ahead and just share in terms of this PowerPoint. Let me go here. I'm assuming you see my screen, correct? Yes, okay. So I want to start off saying, combating myths 20 years, 29 years after Rodney King. And I think for the model minority myth that was instigated by white leaders in the 60s on Time magazine, that was really intended to pit the Asian community against other communities of color and artificially set us up as a model minority and to point to us and say, hey, you other communities of color, why aren't you doing the same? When in reality, that is totally so far from the truth, because we are also facing discrimination in this country and we also have our share of pain. However, one area that really stands out for Asians compared to any other group is our educational attainment. And so everyone points to our education attainment as a reason for success. And so if you look, bachelor's, master's, professional, and doctorate degree, we definitely shoot through the roof compared to any other group. And you could say that is a model minority per se. But I just related to this 2 points. As a Korean American, my parents came to the United States for the children's education. And, all throughout my life until in my early 30s, I didn't go to hospital because we had no money. But I remember one time I was keeling over. I had huge fever blisters and my mom working on a minimum wage job for which every hour was so precious. She begged me to put my foot on the campus, and if I couldn't stand it any longer, that she would come back and drive me home. That is the kind of commitment from Asian community, because in the home country, education is it. There is no vocations or vocational training or any other. Education is the way out. And that's why many immigrated to the United States. And that's why they will forego vacations, new clothes, even healthcare to make sure that their children receives this education. One exception, if you disaggregate the Asian community, first of all, there's over 80 plus ethnic groups under the AAPI. It's a political, artificial grouping. And so many of us actually do not enjoy much of this privilege. And so you'll see for the Pacific Islanders that they have the highest high school dropout rate. But because this whole 80 groups plus is aggregated, their pain is nowhere visible. But long story short, everyone says education is key to success in the world. But you'll see here that in the study of the likelihood of being promoted to management, actually Asians in the private sector here in blue, only Asians are 55% likelihood being promoted to management. African American, 65%, Hispanic, 74%, and white, 111% likelihood of being promoted to management. And then you look at the university and federal government, which is in red and green. And because of additional regulations, you think that there will be better, right, a promotion likelihood. Well, for the African American Hispanic, yes, that's right. There is a better likelihood, but for Asians, it drops even further to 41 and 30%. And so I'm just giving one example of many places where our community is hurting. But the way that discrimination is defined in this country, perhaps maybe to look at, it's usually binary in terms of black on white framework and leaves the Asian and the Latino community out. But again, if you were to say, look at the return on investment made, perhaps Asians would be one of the highest victims here. I want to go over some of the myths, as mentioned, that we tell of one another. And in my recent conversations with, again, leaders from Black allies, they were sharing how perhaps when they're reaching out to their colleagues, that many of them say, well, the Asians, and then they give series of comments. And so I want to share some of them, but be able to, again, share some additional elements that may give a greater truth as well. So one is that we receive special money And that, one of the things from government to buy businesses that are not available to the Black community, that we steal these business opportunities. And I just want to say my father-in-law, he was a successful businessman, family problems led him to come to the United States. And because of his language barrier, ultimately he worked as a janitor for 10 years. And it was only when he referred a client to an immigration attorney that it led to a seed money of $20,000 to buy a business. But it wasn't enough. And the business owner carried the loan, and basically a Korean bank gave him a loan. So he went in highly leveraged, under-resourced. And studies have shown that really for Asian-owned businesses, there's a lot more when there are Asian-owned banks. So Asians also face discrimination in terms of lending access as well. And so my father-in-law went in highly leveraged, under-resourced, and basically because typically it takes two people, two shifts to work, but because my father-in-law didn't have money, he took on the 2 shifts and took on the 16-hour days. And because the commute would not allow him to come back and sleep enough, there was a house attached, and for the first 3 years, he did not go home Monday through Friday. And my husband, as soon as he graduated from 8th grade, basically was given a car, not to enjoy, but to go to work and replace his dad during the weekends. And so that was for 3 days. And so many of them worked 7 days, no holidays, no vacation. And so really, I know that there's the accusation that they make a lot of money on the backs of the community, but my husband calculated the wage. And again, because again, not just that he didn't have money, so he used also free family labor, right? When he calculated the wage, it was less than minimum wage. And also the fact that there's this accusation of that the store owners are targeting communities of color, Black communities to exploit when purchasing their business. But really it comes more out of just lack of options. When you're working minimum wage and you save a little bit of money, where can you buy? And so again, I just want to put that out there. And then we're also perceived as outsiders, not part of the community. But again, they live there longer than the average resident. And so in that way, really, again, they have more to gain if the neighborhood improves, right? At minimum, a safer work environment, greater income stream. And then also that they're rude, racist. And so I do want to address that. Most recently, I went to El Pollo chicken, no, Kentucky Fried, no, El Pollo chicken, no, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And the cashier was so rude. It pissed me off. And basically, I told her a word or two, right? And so I could imagine for any person, receiving rude service, or racist service, whatever it may be, is one that anyone shouldn't tolerate. And I can tell you that I've been to Korean restaurants where the waitress doesn't even acknowledge my request. And the only reason I know that they heard is because they'll bring whatever I requested, but there's no acknowledgement, right? And so even those incidents is infuriating. At the same time, I do want to say that I remember going to Korea and visiting these shopping centers. And I don't know if some of you may have gone to Korea, but there's some good shopping. But the store owners, as soon as you come in, they're so nice. But as soon as they learn that you're not going to buy anything, they turn into Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, right? And so I've learned, wow, this is really bad, right? But I went a few years ago on Korean airline business class. It was the first time in my life. And the flight attendants were one of the nicest, sweetest, so nice that you almost felt bad asking them anything. They bent over backwards. And I thought, my God, this is the same group of people, Koreans, but, one, being so rude, and then the other being so nice to the point where you felt guilty asking for anything. And so I just want to say that really, for many of these store owners, they're working long hours, they're vulnerable, they lack training, they're fatigued. And they are also victims of a lot of racist comments, of shoplifting, and also is a very dangerous job. And so perhaps, again, looking at these store owners, again, not to excuse their bad service, like I said, I get pissed off too, right? But perhaps looking at them with perhaps new eyes. Another piece is around gun toting. I just want to say that, in the LA riots, the picture is of these Koreans with guns shooting, but the police really failed our community. And basically, gang members and others were coming to destroy. And so a number of them were using their guns in response to some of the attacks that happened as well. I also want to share that I know with Sunja Du and Latasha Harlins that it is something that is super sensitive, for which, again, it is really outrageous that Sunja Du did not receive any kind of prison time for her actions. And it was the criminal justice system who put out that verdict. And so for many Korean Americans, even when I talk today, they really say it was wrong that Sunja Du did not receive some kind of jail time and for her actions as well. And for many, again, folks, I've been told that, it's the Korean store owners who are out there killing Black lives, customers, etc. But I do want to say, I remember just like now in the past year, and I have so many articles because I'm on a lot of social media feeds. It's literally every day without imagination that some Asian is being assaulted, killed, shot, whatever, every day in the news. But in the last perhaps 29 years, I had not seen as many, and perhaps it's because of social media and with President Trump that there's a lot more, or perhaps more is being reported. But again, the last 20 years, I did not see that same kind of activity. But back during the LA riots time, I was an MBA student, and I would come home after a group project around 10 o'clock at night when my parents would have the Korean news on. And literally at that time, it felt like every night there was news of some Korean store owner that was being either held up or killed or hurt by communities of color running their business. But none of that was ever shared on mainstream media. And I want to share, I recently saw this on, it was from the Department of Justice, and perhaps for Asians, we are victimized most of violent crimes outside our own race. And so for Asians, it's 76%, Latinos, 55%, white, 38%, and for Blacks, 36% experience violent crimes outside of their own ethnicity. And then I looked at also the Black on Asian crime, and it is actually very significant that 280 times Asians are experiencing Black on Asian crime versus the other way around. And so for, again, many of the store owners, this is a very dangerous job for which there is that trauma. And perhaps, again, when I go back to the question of, that wheelchair, right? That these store owners, even though there's this narrative that's put them into the category of evil, that if you were to look with some new eyes and to say, gosh, they're also in the same economic wheelchairs. We're on the same team. What can we do? And so I think of, for us as an organization, looking at it that way, one of the things that we do is we have a job training site. And so the federal government pays for the workers to come and get job training. And so, for these, a common request is that why don't these store owners hire from the community? But as I mentioned, they're working 2 shifts using free family labor for many of them. And so that's not a reality that is possible. But perhaps if the city or someone else was to partner with nonprofit to place workers from the local community, right, on a job training program, that individual will get job training and business training. The store owner will at least get an extra worker and perhaps get some extra help. and maybe the worker will be an English speaker, and also maybe he or she will be able to see what's happening in the store owner business, right? And could be a bridge builder, an ambassador. And so I think that looking at our situations, the tensions that we have of one another, narratives that we tell one another, and being able to look with new eyes, fresh eyes, and to see again that we're in that same economic wheelchair could lead to better solutions versus futile arguments and discussions that lead to nowhere. I just want to highlight a few more data points. You'll see that, as mentioned, in LA County, Koreans had the lowest home ownership rate of any group, contrary to the model minority myth. And this was true even nationally. You'll see Koreans with Hispanic, Hmong, Bangladeshi. This is old. We're planning to find some additional data. But even in terms of assets, right there, you'll see that Koreans are right there with US Blacks, Koreans, and Mexicans in terms of total assets for LA County. So, and then I mentioned already about the damages, right, during the LA riots. And convenience store employees suffer from the highest rates of workplace homicide, second only to taxi cab drivers. And I just want to say that if it is guaranteed that you will encounter being held up, how many of us would take on that job unless our options are otherwise? And you'll see even around discrimination that right there, the solidarity, right, in the home buying process, Asians are the highest, but really African-American, Hispanic, we're all in the same boat. And even in the rental process, again, Asians are second highest, but we're all in the same boat. In the criminal justice system, you'll see that, you know, youth should be tried in juvenile courts, but Asian Latino youth have the highest rates of being tried in adult courts. But once tried, Asian and Black youth have the highest rates of being imprisoned as well. And then you look at just AAPI, we represent 31% of LA's poor or low income, right? And then you'll see just the language barrier. For many of us, you know, is a barrier to access to whatever services available. And you'll see that for Koreans it's 60%. And then you'll see again poverty levels, right? They're comparable. Cambodians and others are, you know, even here again, in terms of low income, 62%, 37% as well. But when you aggregate it, again, it hides the pain of different communities. And finally, I wanted to say, even around youth here, we represent over 15% of the city county population, but the youth program by the city of LA, only 1.6% of youth got access to some of the higher LA programs. And this is just one example of where we continue to be left out. Finally, around immigration, I know that a lot of times it's attached to the Hispanic community, but really, over 10% of the 11 million undocumented are Asians. 40% of the legal family visa backlog are Asians. Typically, they have to wait 12 to 23 years. We make up also 84% of the employer visa backlog. 40% of the dreamers in California are AAPI. And 250,000 AAPIs have been deported. And so these are some of the immigration and criminal justice systems that impact all of us. And so I just want to conclude again that really for all of us, I just highlighted one example of myths that the Asian community that we face that are told by other communities. But I think at the end of the day, we tell myths, right, of others. Whether it's black on brown, brown on black, you know, black on white, you know, white on black, you know, it's just Asian on Latinos and vice versa. And I really hope that through this presentation that you would look with greater curiosity, right? And give our other communities the benefit of doubt, just as I did with some of the leaders in the Black community. when they were sharing things that really hurt, was infuriating / frustrating. And I knew that there was greater truth, and be able to find where are those disconnects and to find solutions, right, that could lead to better opportunities for all of us. Thank you.
Dr. Em, I want to thank you on behalf of the Dramamine Institute, as well as on behalf of Dr. Samad, for your engaging presentation, as well as the information that you provided in your slides. Before I pose some of the questions that were presented to us in the question and answer section of the Zoom, will your PowerPoint be available for individuals?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And also, I didn't get to share in my presentation, but we have a disproportion of COVID-19 on the Asian American community. And so I'd be happy to share that as well. My goal, again, at the end of the day, is to build solidarity. We are all on the same team.
Okay. And so I'll just assume that you'll provide that to Dr. Samad, and as we, as a institute, put up the link for this presentation, as we did for the first portion, it will most likely be available then. And so I know that was a couple of individuals who asked that question, and so I'm hopefully answering that question as we have this dialogue between the two of us. So with that being said, a question from the field, question and answer session, somewhat spins off of your conversation, somewhat of your dialogue. The model minority myth rolls along with the civil rights movement when activists were building solidarity through the movement. How can people now scale up ways of engaging popular education across communities while building relationships to learn from each other?
So if I understood it correctly, I think that I've been involved with the Jewish community, but they brought a multi-ethnic community to ensure that there was ethnic history incorporated into California's education system. So I think that that is definitely one piece that we should all be fighting for, because a lot of times, again, our history, our contribution, our pain, the evilness of, again, racism has been omitted, erased. And so by understanding how evil human beings can be, how systems can be, I think would be something that would help build solidarity for all of us. And I do want to say that during my seminary days, I had a chance to visit the Appalachians. I was literally shocked that this was America. And this is like all white, a community, but there was no bus. They did have cars, but there was no busing system. There was no hotels, no restaurants. If I had not known anyone there, I would have been like, it's back in the, I don't know, 1600s or wherever, where I'm living in the wilderness. And so again, I think that it's really important to be able to see where each of our communities are, including, I would say, the white community as well.
Okay. The second question, I believe, is a little presumptuous about maybe your background and knowledge on, I guess, current events as well as former events. And so I'll ask it. If it's not something that you can fill, then please just understand that I'm delivering a question. It says, at the end of her presentation, please ask her to do, I guess, the difference between the Latasha Harlins death and the initiation of the George Floyd death started within the Asian Manager liquor store.
Well, I think that I try to share that for the Asian community, the Sunjadu situation was one of many that the Asian store owners faced, or Korean store owners faced during that season of life. Unfortunately, I would say the mainstream media did not cover perhaps also the trauma and the assaults that many of the store owners were also experiencing. And I, again, do not condone a killing, of anyone, especially in that situation with Sunjadu. But again, it was not all store owners, and also that it was the criminal justice system that inflicted that decision. And so, you know, as mentioned, if there was that kind of an equivalency where many store owners of the Korean community were attacked and their livelihood destroyed because of Latasha Harlins, even though it was a criminal justice system, for many of the store owners, again, they were victims of being killed. I mean, so many lives being killed during that time from communities, especially from the Black community. And, you know, it doesn't make sense if all the Korean community was to go out and shoot everyone or destroy or whatever. So I really want to say that for many of the store owners, again, they in their own way have been victims of racism, trauma, poverty, etc. And there have been incidents where it's Black and Asian or Asian and Black. And if we were to just kind of concentrate there on the individual cases, I think that it hurts all of us. But if we were to look and say what led to, you know, that situation and be able to come with better solutions. So I wouldn't want to, at least this is my personal opinion, put that as an equivalent. I think for George Floyd, the fact that the police did not honor, live up to its, you know, duty to serve and protect. And when it was, especially in the witness of everyone saying, why are you doing this? I mean, he was down. I mean, there was no need to kill, no need at all. And for such, I think the world was able to rally, including the Asian community, on the injustice of that situation of a system. But again, with Latasha Harlin and Sun Jadu, I think there's some additional nuances for which I think we all need healing. And that's part of the reason I invested so much time today, to just kind of be able to tell a greater truth. And perhaps, again, by looking at these store owners, perhaps not as in power of being privileged, because as Asians, again, we don't get any of the benefits of white privilege. You look at corporate America board or leaderships, the C-suites, or any of that, Asians continue to be left out and omitted, perhaps. And so that, you know, we're all in there same together, the same economic wheelchairs, and to yell and be angry at those who are in a wheelchair to jump, it doesn't lead to, again, good solutions. And so I am saying that let's pause and look at each other's pains and help each other by, again, looking at the greater truth.
Okay. Fantastic. Next question. Can you explain the success story of the Asian American?
So when you say success, I was mentioning, for example, that if you look at education, it comes with great cost and sacrifice. And even in terms of business ownership, it comes with great cost and sacrifice. But then if you look at, again, C-suites, if you look at, you know, board appointments, if you look at funding and resources, but even on the COVID-19 presentation, you'll see that many of us are frontline workers, essential business owners. COVID-19 has had disproportionate, I mean, like in LA County, May 2020, Asians had the highest death rate of any group. And so I'm just giving one example. So when people say success, one thought that came to mind is that sometimes they put Asian, when they aggregate and look at Asian income, a lot of times it's household income, and Asians don't necessarily live in nuclear families. And so there's a greater family size versus individual income. And they also live in usually high cost metropolitan areas as well. So those are just some nuances to cover. So, I mean, gosh, if we were truly successful, I would celebrate. But as you've seen in some of those data points, that is far from the truth.
Okay. Spinning off of that first question, it was a two-part question. I just didn't want to put them together at the same time. Assuming that others can be brought together, how do you think that others can achieve the Asian American success story?
Well,
I mean, it's okay to think about it. So
let me. So basically, they're saying, how can others achieve the Asian success story? Is that what I heard?
I'm reading it as verbatim, or whatever, right? I'm
Okay.
trying to synopsize it so it makes sense for both of us.
Well,
And so it does come into assuming that others can be brought together. I'm thinking others meaning all others outside of the Asian American. Um, how can they achieve the success or the success story of the Asian Americans?
How do you explain the success of Asian, assuming that is brought together? How do you plan to achieve it? Well, so maybe because I think it's not as crystal clear, but I would say that each community, I think, has, because of their history in the United States, we all have our gifting. And perhaps even small business ownership, we may be not making a lot of money, but we figured out how to get in, right? And so for maybe the Asian community, we could share our success stories. But you know what? I really don't see that many Asians, for example, in the NBA. How many Oprah Winfreys do we have in the world, right? That are Asian per se. And so again, I think that each community, we have, again, because of our own history, places where we have excelled or have been able to have certain strengths. And so I think in that way, when we, again, bring our individual gifts to share with one another, right, then we could unite our voices to, again, go for the bigger pie and not just, again, fight over crumbs. And so I hope I'm helping to answer that. And again, for me, in terms of solidarity, my conclusion is if we could stop hating, start connecting, right? Stop telling the myths, right, of one another that really put each other in the category of evil, and really celebrate each other's gifting and contribution, and make that visible, right? So that all of us belong. Because it's not like a one-off, right? It's sad that there has to be diversity and inclusion in this country, like a department has to be set up, which says that for so many of us, we're being told we don't belong, right? And so I think of, again, Susan Boyle with Britain's Got Talent. I think for many of us, we are Susan Boyles of this world before we come on that stage, right? We come and we don't look the part of belonging. And so the world disses us and hates us, right? But if we're given that platform for us to be able to first cultivate our God-given potential and the platform to shine our light, that our light could be recognized and be visible, then I think we could have a Susan Boyle moment for all of us. And what I mean by that, that was a very defining, transformative moment. As soon as she opened her mouth and started to sing, that moment, the world was able to be blessed, right? Receive the blessing of Susan Boyle. And vice versa, Susan Boyle also got blessed, right? And I think for, again, each one of us, we are Susan Boyles. We've never been given the cultivation or the platform where our God-given light could shine. But once we, each of us, are able to do that, we could bless the world. The world can be blessed, right? And we also can be blessed as well.
Yeah. And so I'm reviewing the other submissions. Tons of appreciation for you, for your voice, for the knowledge that you provided us today. Tons of thank yous for being a source and service for the community. There weren't any other questions that I wasn't able to synopsize into or combine with others. And so I want to say to you, thank you again.
Thank you for that. I saw a comment. I saw one comment. I didn't get to read everything, but I just saw a quick comment that someone mentioned that the Latino businesses were also impacted by the LA riot. So that's kind of, again, another narrative that I didn't know until actually at the 25th anniversary of, because for me, my narrative is, oh, the Koreans, right? We've been disproportionately impacted and blah, blah, blah. But actually it was the 25th that I actually came to realize that particularly the Latino community was also seriously impacted. So I want to just thank whoever was highlighting that basically the police did fail to protect anyone else except the white community, right? And so actually, as we're coming to the 30th anniversary commemoration, which is next year, we'll be kicking off this year with series of events. But I wanted to definitely make room to lift up the stories of Latin-owned businesses who were also impacted by the LA riots. So I'm also in the process of learning. And I think, again, that if we could all open ourselves to become curious, right, to be receptive, to hear new stories, new narratives, right, to reframe our narratives, I think it would make a great day.
Good, good. Thank you so much again, Dr.
Thank
Samad.
you.
Yes.
Turn it over to you.
We
You're
can't
on
hear
mute.
you. We can't hear you.
Here we go. All right. Hi, Penn. Thank you very much. As you know, remember that you and I facilitated a panel that you were on the 20th anniversary, which was the last public appearance of Rodney King
Yes.
that he made in Los Angeles before his untimely death. And you have always been on point in terms of the truth around otherness. I mean, the takeaway here is why do we spend so much time focusing on each other when we're all impacted by the same system? Okay. And we're all being subjugated in one way or another. And we spend time either tribalizing, trying to keep to ourselves, either to protect ourselves or to discriminate against others. Or we're all impacted by the same numbers. And thank you for your PowerPoint presentation. I believe I've seen some aspects of it before in some of your other presentations, but it's good to remind new audiences that particularly as it relates to violence, the disproportionality that Asian American and Pacific Islanders face as it relates to violence brought on by others outside of their race. I think that was a real important slide and something for the African American and Latino communities to understand that, the impact that is caused. We see crime statistics, but we don't see them disaggregated in a way by race and who commits the crime and who's the victim and those types of things. And then the other important point that you made that I think is a great takeaway, and I know you have a call to jump on, so I'll make it quick, is that the mainstream media does a very poor job
Yes.
of highlighting
Yes. Yes.
against Black communities. A single person could come up missing in the white community and it'll be on mainstream media for days, and all of the print media. But that is not the case in communities of color.
That's right.
That's a form of othering that, if we don't tell our stories are not going to get told. And that's one of the things that the Donnelly Institute is doing, is building a digital archive of institutional memory of our community because it hasn't been told by other
That would be great. And I do want to add that even for me as an Asian American, because again, when I studied US history, none of the stories were told of our community. And I saw a Facebook posting of a poster with certain key dates. And I was curious because I had never seen those dates, and I looked them up. And I mean, like literally, like whole towns are burned down, and because of jealousy, particularly from workers, like Chinese workers or others. And so of lynching, that the greatest or the largest lynching incident was actually on Chinese community in LA, right? As well. So again, there were so many of these accounts that I had never seen as an Asian American, let alone I'm sure other communities. So again, I really go back to, I'm glad that the Institute is going to capture these stories again of our history for all our communities. So thank you for that as well.
And I think we're in a period, as you see, the County Board of Supervisors just voted to give Bruce Beach and Manhattan Beach back to their descendants because they misused government authority in taking that land for eminent domain purposes when it basically was to run them out of the city. So
Yes.
my concluding statement to you, we're going to continue to talk about this for as much time as we have left, which is about another hour. But I want to thank you and volunteer California State University, Dominguez Hills and the Dimely Institute to participate in any activities you have for the 30th anniversary, as we did for the 20th anniversary.
I love it. I love it. I almost want to say, but this is kicking it off.
Right.
But yes,
Well,
I definitely welcome that. And I think that in the current climate, where really, again, you know, with George Floyd, with awareness and then the anti-Asian hate, I feel like, again, this has been very historic in terms of creating some new levels of solidarity. And I really look forward to wisdom, especially around I think the question of Latasha Harlan's. You know, I would welcome, again, advice, guidance of how we can address that story in such a way that we don't deny the truth, but perhaps we could also reframe it in such a way that is healing, right? That builds, again, greater solidarity for our communities as well.
Concur. We can never use the exception as the rule. And just a cultural statement, Black people hold on to things for a long time. You know, we're not taking vaccines because we're still talking about the Tuskegee experiments. Okay, so you might have another 20 or 30 years that you might have to explain that one, but we certainly appreciate the work you do, and you don't do it just in your own community. You partner with every community that's here in Southern California in the region. And we're just fortunate enough to be able to have you. Thank you. I know your schedule's busy, so thank you very much for, you know, responding to an old friend and making yourself available for this anti-racism presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Samad, again, for your friendship. And also thank you, Dr. Dwayne Davis, for your service as well. And thank you to all the other panelists that I'll be unfortunately not able to hear as well. But God bless you. Thank you.
God bless you. So, Dr. Davis, I'd like to take the opportunity to raise some of the salient points in Hai-Pin's presentation to see how our audience will respond to that conversation.
Great.
And she took the gloves off and said, you know, why do we hate on each other? And why do our communities spend such a disproportionate amount of time focusing on the little that each community has versus, in other words, why do we focus on the slice versus the whole cake? You know, we compete against each other. You know, we hate on each other, we fight each other, you know, we, you know, undermine each other in some very racist and racial confrontations at times. At some point in time, the respective communities under the People of Color banner have to recognize that in terms of trying to do better, we do have competing interests. And how do we pursue those interests without biting on each other? That's kind of the questioning that I'd like to the line of questioning that I'd like to see us go in.
Yeah, and so that actually was a great lead into whatever discussion we can have as a group. We have several participants still. As I reviewed the questions and answer session, many of the statements, well, excuse me, many of what's here are opinions and statements and comments. As I mentioned to Dr. M or Ms. M, more of an appreciation and gratitude for her presence and presentation. But I believe what you have opened up is a great conversation for us to have. And so with that being said, those individuals in the audience, those are attendees who would like to present a question for us as a panelist, if you will, in fact, de facto panelist, if you will. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat and I will ask them and we will try to fill them for you. What I want to do is I'm going to dismiss the current ones because those are more so for Dr. M, and there aren't even questions. They're more, again, comments and opinions. If you feel as though your comment needed to be heard, then I'm going to ask you to resubmit it, because I want to make certain we stay on topic with the point that was brought up by Dr. Samad. So it is 1:05. Anything before 1 o'clock has been dismissed. New questions? Here's one. And this, again, more of a statement, but it came in at 1 o'clock. I've experienced more than once in a Korean-owned beauty supply being disrespected. Being asked to leave because I was taking too long to make a decision about my purchase. Is it rude to rush a person to spend their money? I always feel like you need to hurry up and make your purchase or get out the store. This lets Black people know you don't care about anything but getting our money, and don't take stake in ownership for your obligation to our community. Again, statement more so than question, but it can be, I guess, rephrased into a question as we think.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, because Hypen did touch on that. And I touched on that in my earlier comments. That's no different than Black people being followed around a high-end store when they go to Nordstrom's or Macy's or any other of those high-end stores. In one of my past lives, I was a mystery shopper. They look for folk who will tell them, my company is Samad Associates. We were hired to do a certain amount of shopping. They gave us money to shop because they had gotten complaints of some racial discrimination against consumers and patrons. And sure enough, as a Black male, and I didn't dress up, I dressed down, and I was followed around a few stores. In fact, I took them on 3 levels. So since I knew they was following me, I went up the escalator, up the other escalator, down the escalator, because I wanted to make sure, that I was being profiled. And I think when she didn't spend a lot of time talking about the cultural barriers and cultural impediments, but certainly the media and television and the movies hasn't done a good job of portraying African Americans, particularly African American males. And I think that one of the things that we see in today's racial conflicts is being othered because they don't believe we belong in the space. The 3 of you that are here on this call, as well as myself, as well as others that I know that are watching this, happen to be well off, high wealth individuals. And when they travel, they're profiled in the airports, they're profiled sometime in other countries, they're profiled in resorts, they're profiled in high-end restaurants. The subtleties of the racial microaggressions play out regularly. And so my point is, I don't necessarily think that this is a Korean thing. A lot of times because of the dangers that they face, and let's not pretend that poverty areas and low income areas don't have a high degree of crime and a high degree of risk. I'm sure if you had some Black business owners on this call, and we will in our 3rd series, when we talk about devaluation in the fall, and we're going to have representatives across the racial spectrum that say, look, I'm part of the community, and you robbing me, and you breaking into my business and you tearing down my stores. So poverty is a factor in that. and Korean businesses are disproportionately represented in poverty areas, which disproportionately are African American. And so, you know, I wouldn't necessarily paint that as a Black Korean issue. I'd paint that as a class issue. And I think more times than not, it is that has some racial underlinings to it based on how African Americans are represented in a larger community.
Yeah, I agree with you. Question, actually my question, I didn't have opportunity to ask because I was trying to make certain I got our attendees' questions in. She mentioned the elephant in the room as she opened up her presentation. And I'm always curious, well, because I actually see it oftentimes on who is safe to talk about the elephant in the room. Because I know oftentimes as we have those conversations, we can be demonized or viewed as the angry Black man or whatever the case may be. And so speak to that about the elephant in the room and the safety of speaking on whatever the elephant in the room may be for various groups and organizations.
Well, I'll hit it and then I'll let Judge Mack hit it. But I think that when we talk about race, we are so disproportionately focused on the white man and institutional and systemic racism out of a system that was created by and large Eurocentricity. We act like all people of color in the room are cool. We act like Blacks and Latinos don't have no beef. We act like, you know, Asians and Blacks don't have no beef, or Asians and Latinos don't have no beef. We act like, you know, all is cool with East Indians, and, you know, in which they have a fair share of the racial microaggressions pitted against poor students, whether they be Black or brown, and they suffer a disproportionate amount of racism from white people and others, you know, particularly when they're in the professions, be it in the academic professions or the medical professions, who don't trust their preparation and knowledge. And so the 800-pound gorilla is, have we really checked our biases at the door when we're meeting in multiracial, multicultural situations? Now, Hai Pin did point out one very important fact, which the history of racism has by and large been bifocal, Black and white. But over the last 40 years, it has been multifocal, okay? Racism has been exacted in different forms, you know, against Blacks, Asians, Latinos, you know, Middle Easterners, East Indians. And that doesn't even take into consideration religion and sexuality, okay? And so what we need to be clear about is when we have these multiracial gatherings, we can't act like we're all in the room for one purpose. Okay, that is really the 800-pound gorilla is, yeah, we're talking about racism, but are we talking about racism, you know, that Blacks have against Asians? That was her way of saying, you know, Blacks are disproportionately involved in this. And I wanted her to say that because when you look at the current attacks on Asians, you see just as many African Americans attacking Asians as you see white people or others. And Latinos are in the middle of that too. Okay, so we can't act like we don't have these intra-race battles outside of the common recognition that America has set up a racist system that is largely privileging white people, because that's just not the case.
Okay. Next question. And thank you for your submission, Carol. Why can't we focus on our similarities rather than our differences? Why can't we not stop thinking all blank are and give each person a chance? When you are half Black, half Asian, what are you? Our generation is all mixed. Lines between groups get blurred.
You want to handle that, Judge Mack?
I'm just reading.
Y'all should be tired of hearing me talk.
No, that I had to think of. No, I had to.
I'm sorry, Dr. Davis. It would be very nice to focus upon, our similarities. But the fact of the matter is our differences is what fuels the media. Our differences fuel this dialogue, and our differences fuel the racist agenda. Now, if you look at whether or not we're really different, no, we're not really different, but we've been categorized to believe that we are different. Therefore, we continue to operate on that basis and interact with other groups on that premise. Now, you can't have a fair fight when you have one person whose hands are tied behind their back and say, okay, we're all on a level playing field. So to deal with our similarities means that we are all at the same place. We are not all at the same place. And there are historical racist agendas that we have to reckon with before we can ever have that conversation in truth about all of our similarities, because our differences will continue to be the focus of or highlighted in this society. Now, some of the things that she said, kind of got my interest, and I wanted to push back a little bit, push back as an African-American woman. And I think our African-American women, as a woman, my experiences are a little bit different. If I go into an Asian shop, well, yes, I might try to look for African-American shops to patronize. I might try to look at other ways to start recirculate Black dollars. But the truth of the matter is that's prohibited, that's limited, and that's a financial and economic conversation that has to do with racism. That has persisted since our financial communities were systematically dismantled. So I think that if we're going to have this conversation, there has to be a recognition that not everybody gets a $10,000 grant. Not everybody gets a loan. Not everyone has access. Not everyone is going to get the kind of pass that other races may get because it feeds into the narrative about Black people. Did that answer the question?
It did. I'd like to add just a little to it, though.
Sure.
The resistance that we have in terms of talking about race, and this is part of the conversation, where we include white people, because whites are color too. Okay, so we could talk about colored people only. Well, this is the white part. When we talk about reconciliation, we have to talk about what happened. Okay, which is a part of the conversation that many white people are intolerant of. Why can't we just start from right here and move forward? Well, if you punch me and they say, okay, come on, let's be friends. Well, we're not gonna be friends till we talk about what you just did. Okay. And then one of the things that High Penn pointed out, and you pointed out, Dr. Davis, is we use false equivalencies and false comparisons to try to advance the arguments. Okay, and so you have a couple of generations of white people now who say, well, look, I never owned slaves. Why should I pay reparations? Well, in America, if you inherit the benefit, you also inherit the debt. If your parents leave you their house, okay, yeah, you get the house, but you also get the debt on the house. And the whole conversation around race has been very unsophisticated in that regard. They want to start from this point forward. When generations of African Americans have been robbed or kept out of government programs that assisted whites in acquiring wealth, okay, that Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and others were excluded from. So a debt accrued as a result of that exclusion. And it was a white woman who brought reparations up in the 2020 presidential debate, Marianne Williamson, who said America's never going to be right until it pays that debt. You can't continue to accumulate wealth. The wealth gap gets wider, but you say, I'm not going to pay nothing. Oh, no, you're going to pay something. Okay. And, you know, I used to tell my students and still tell my students, last time white folk fell out like this, we got freedom. This time it's going to be reparations, because we're really getting to the crux of what race is. Race is economic. This is about maintaining an advantage that has been set up based on a racial pecking order. Okay. And until that gap is closed, the folks start getting all glazed eyed and red and pink and brown and all different kind of colors when you start talking about giving something back. Okay. And so you want to talk about, why can't we just start from here? Yeah, we could start from here once you give me back some of what you took, because that is what is really perpetuating the race divide.
And I'd like to add to that, she mentioned, why can't we talk about the similarity as opposed to the differences? And I'll say, if we only focus on the similarities, the differences will just widen. And at some point, and how do we bridge that gap? And you mentioned, being a mixed individual. Well, I'm certain both sides look at you very differently, as all groups do. And so if we were to just say, let's focus on the similarities and not even pay attention to the differences, then how will we ever become equitable and have equality amongst all groups that you would like for us to have? Not just meaning us, meaning African Americans or Black Americans, but as a people, as humans. It doesn't happen just because we're saying we're similar. It doesn't happen because we are allowing differences to perpetuate and extend without it being addressed. And so if there are some similarities, let's all have the same similarities, as opposed to there being some differences at all. But unfortunately, there is. Next question, and I have to synopsize this because it's a little lofty as a question, but nevertheless, I will try it. It is based around the premise of love. Why have they, meaning others, not given credence to the greatest value of all time? I believe love. Love should be on the table. Love should be a study and a series of courses in the educational system. Too much is placed on the irrationality of behavior rather than on the solution of their irrational behavior. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I'll jump in on that. LeBron James has himself embroiled in a controversy right now where he had to take down a tweet. But when Doc Rivers was the coach of the Clippers, somebody on this Zoom call's favorite team, after the killing of George Floyd, he says he didn't understand why, Blacks continue to love America, but America doesn't love us back. And I'm a true believer that in order to get love, you have to give love. I'm an old rock head before I became a jazz head. And the Beatles said in their last song, the love you take is equal to the love you make. So if you don't make any love, then you can't take any love. And we need to really begin to examine that concept because it really is a concept of nature. You give what you get, you receive, what you put out, or in biblical terms, you reap what you sow. If you sow in hate, then you're going to receive hate back at some point in time. Folk want to say it's karma. Folk want to say, it's the greater, being. But the bottom line is, if you see someone always struggling with trauma and with, conflict and controversy, is because that's what they sow. That's what they breed. If you see somebody who's constantly being blessed, it's because they're blessing others. And that is something we can all take across different race, nationalities, religions, sexuality. You treat people as you want to be treated. That has always been my mantra. People who extend respect to me, I extend respect back. You talk crazy to me, you're gonna get talk crazy too. And that's just the reality.
So here's a question from earlier, and I wanted to follow or circle back around to it because I think it's appropriate at this time. It appears that Koreatown here in Los Angeles has expanded in all directions and grown over the past 20 years, where more and more businesses have been developed. What do you think caused this, and how did this happen?
Well, I will say this. I don't think Hai-Ping was forthcoming. There were a couple of things I disagreed with her also. Koreans were not able to rebuild Koreatown. At the end of 1992, Koreatown was 6 square blocks, literally, maybe 10. Now it's about 30 square blocks. And they do work outside of the banking system. They do not get money from American banks, but they get money from banks to help rebuild.
Korean banks.
And they also got money from philanthropy. And so those are levels of economic investment that the other communities can learn from. Okay. And I'll just leave it at that. Somebody, I think you're muted now, Dr. D.
I'm sorry. It's approaching 1:30. I want to pose this question because it's in a question form and I don't need to synopsize it. What do you think about social justice and housing and affordable housing? And how are companies able to deny people based on color?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about that, then I'll hand it off to Judge Mack. There is a report coming out later this year called the State of Black Los Angeles. It's supposed to be out in August. And the Dimely Institute, specifically myself, was tasked to write the section on housing and the economy and how it impacts homelessness. I basically think that for a 10-year period that the developer forces overtook the policy forces. And while the policy forces, try to pass measures to spur housing, they can't build the housing quick enough. And I think that there was some legitimacy to the slide that Hai-Ping presented around discrimination in housing against Blacks and Asians, even though you don't have Asian homeless that you see in terms of Black homelessness. Black people are literally falling out of their homes. They're not able to rent, once they've been evicted because they have evictions on their record and credit impacts their ability to get another place. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to recognize is that Los Angeles, which is now the most expensive city in the nation, okay? And basically, the most recent study says we're number 3 behind San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Miami, Florida. But we've been number 1. We're more expensive now than San Francisco. We're more expensive now than New York. We're more expensive now than Washington, D.C. Okay, and basically our median income here in the city is $60,000, just above $60,000. You're not going to be able to afford a house in Los Angeles on a wage of $60,000, and so. We are going to have to look at a government intervention, whether it is the federal government or the state government in terms of housing subsidies. They're already beginning to talk about housing subsidies or or giving away free money in the city of Los Angeles as they did in Stockton. But they're gonna have to do something to help subsidize the cost of living in Los Angeles because it's just not affordable anymore. The Los Angeles today is not the Los Angeles of 40 years ago. And basically, the housing discrimination is economic. And Blacks are at the lower end of the wage earning scale, so they're going to be disproportionately impacted.
And that is all the questions that are presented to us today, Dr. Samad.
You have any closing statements, Judge Macklin? Otherwise, we'll give, folk appreciate it when you give them time back.
This was a very,
Last time they complained, we didn't have enough time for question and answers. So this time we gave them extra time. Now they ain't got to pay, but that's okay. They tuned in.
This has been a very engaging conversation, and it will cause all of us to rethink what we think and how we think about race. But I don't want it to be lost on us that this is really an economic issue. And it plays into the history of our financial position and lack of intergenerational wealth. When we talk about housing or other goods and services, businesses within Los Angeles or the counties, people, kind of look past reparations. Some say, yeah, we'll get it when hell freezes over. Others are really seriously looking at it and considering it, but it is a big part of the equation. And if we could be like more areas that take a page out of the book in Evanston, Illinois, where they actually gave money for housing, and other cities that see that that's necessary in order to decrease this wealth divide, then I think we can start addressing some other issues which deal with our financial plight, home ownership, business ownership, as well as creating larger financial institutions that center on the needs of African Americans. Then I think we can start having a much deeper dialogue about this. But I appreciate it, and I thank you, Dr. Samad and Dr. Davis, for allowing us to have this discussion today and creating this platform. And Dr. Samad, I'm sure you want to talk about the next platform with the few remaining minutes we have left. So we thank everyone for participating today as well.
Thank you, Judge Macklin, for always being supportive in terms of having the Community Advisory Board taken a very integral part of the programming of the Donnelly Institute. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for taking up what I consider to be one of the toughest challenges that has been put before us by our president, Dr. Thomas Parham, which is to have a true and honest engagement around anti-racism and racial reconciliation. As you know, in our last workshop, the Donnelly Institute issued a campus-wide anti-racism challenge. And we're pleased to say that over 12 departments on our campus, including the administration, including the academic senate, have taken up the anti-racism challenge. It's not enough for us to not be racist. We have to become anti-racist. And so our next third part of this series will be in the fall, in September, and it will deal with devaluation of humanity. And of course, the symbol that we use is probably going to generate as much buzz and discussion as the first two has. There were once signs posted throughout the Southwest that said, no Negroes, no Mexicans, no dogs. And so basically they devalued the life of Black and brown humanity to the level of an animal. And we really have to have a conversation as to why we tend to engage in the politics of devaluation. And so please keep your attention for that. We're having a few other activities. This is the next to the last programming activity that the Donnelly Institute will have this semester. On April 30th, we will be having a virtual free jazz festival to honor our affiliation with International Jazz Day. You'll be getting some publicity around that very, very soon. But then our next programming activity will be our ALT program in the summer, African American Leadership Training Summit, which will be virtual this year, sponsored by the California Legislative Black Caucus. And then we hopefully will be back on campus in the fall and maybe even have the opportunity to have our third anti-racism presentation in person. So we'll keep you posted on that. Again, we'd like to thank President Thomas Parham. We're sorry we didn't get his message up today, so I'm probably going to hear something about that. And our provost, Michael Spagna. And I'd like to thank Kara Furman and Fidel Garcia, who have been our IT support, and my student assistant, Anthony Aguadozia. I'm going to get his name right one day, but I think I got close today, who has done a fantastic job of making sure that the Dimely Institute has been on top of its social media and technology game. And so with 20 minutes to spare, we'd like to thank you all for participating in this anti-racism presentation. And again, we challenge you all to become anti-racist in your organizations, in your community. And we need to stop othering each other and embrace each other's humanity. And I look forward to seeing you all soon out in the community. Thank you very much.